since their inception, successful trading card games have run under the model known as power creep. New cards are designed to be slightly better than older ones so as to incentivize players to empty their wallets with every set release. Usually this is done very gradually, only noticeable over a long stretch of time. Sometimes, however, that power creep becomes a power leap, and games can get very broken very quickly. For its first 3 sets, Flesh and Blood was incredibly balanced, where even the best heroes like Dorinthia and Dash weren't so far ahead of everything else. But then Monarch came out, bringing with it the talent system and Chain. And right after that, Tales of Aria released, bringing with it, well, Tales of Aria. Both of these sets introduced cards and heroes that pushed the game to the extreme and left Legend Story Studios, the makers of Flesh and Blood, with 2 options: accept the new power level and design everything up to it, or rely on their unique hero rotation system and power down the game to maintain a better balance in the long run. And in a move rarely seen in trading card games, they chose the latter. From Dynasty forward, there was a clear difference in the power level and design, which has been both positive and negative for the game. And so in this video, I want to go over the powering down of Flesh and Blood, discussing the change in design philosophy, what effect this has had on the game, and what this will hopefully mean for Flesh and Blood moving into the future.
Back! Oh, my back!
Before we talk about how Flesh and Blood has been powered down, we first need to establish what the problems were with the game in the first place. I also want to be very clear here that everything I am about to talk about is specifically about the classic constructed format. While other formats like Blitz and Commoner exist and are great in their own right, CC is the full and truest experience of Flesh and Blood, as well as the main competitive format. So before anyone sounds off in the comments about how what I'm saying doesn't make sense in Blitz, because I'm not talking about Blitz, alright? Okay. Anyways, what had gone so wrong with Flesh and Blood? Well, in an interview with Loyal Duophidia, I'm sorry, I tried, James White, the creator of the game himself, discusses his and his team's design philosophy. James talks about action point economy, focusing specifically on cards that fall under what they call SIP-SIP.
SIP-SIP, so the start and play, stay and play.
Heroes, weapons, and to some extent equipment that give extra action points are easily some of the most powerful cards in the game, as without them, decks are very limited on how much they can do in a turn. Looking at many cards from what James describes as the Generation 1 of Flesh and Blood design philosophy, we have heroes like Chain and Starvo, weapons like Luminaris and Voltaire, and equipment like Snapdragon Scalers and Spellbound Creepers. All of these offer players ways to gain extra action points, often with little to no downside. There's a reason that heroes like Chain with his granting Go Again and making Soul Shackle tokens, Briar with her Embodiment of Lightning tokens, and Starvo with his Draw a Pulse and Keep It in Hand strategy were all dominant heroes in their day. And when it comes to Luminaris and Voltaire, well, James actually mentions these specifically as being problem weapons for the game.
Things like Luminaris, things like Voltaire.
Voltaire can give 2 arrows Go Again for just a single resource each, and Luminaris can give Go Again to basically everything and your grandmother for the low cost of nothing. Pitch a yellow for whatever you're already doing and there you go. You did it. While we don't know for certain, it is widely speculated that signature weapons being added to the Living Legend rotation system, as they weren't originally, was done specifically to remove these 2 weapons out of Classic Constructed. Even equipment, which are by far the most fair of these SIP-SIP cards, are still important to look at, specifically the design of Spellbound Creepers. This card lets you play a non-attack action at instant speed for a single resource, as long as you've blocked or attacked with an attack action. What makes this so powerful is that if your attack doesn't have Go Again, but the non-attack action does, then playing it at instant speed actually refreshes the action point your attack used up. Essentially, this lets you both play the non-attack action and give your attack Go Again at the same time. Sure, it puts a bind counter on the creepers, which requires you to then deal arcane damage to keep them around turn after turn, but oftentimes you just need the one use out of these to swing a game in your favor. And while this card hasn't been too overpowered yet, the ability to cheese Go Again on cards that don't normally have it in this way, it just feels like something that might break the game with some interaction in the future. Needless to say, all this extra Go Again enabled decks to simply just do too much on top of what they were already good at. Because sure, ninjas can go wide as well, but that's their whole strategy. Rune Blades can not only go wide, but also tall in both offense and defense, and also had split damage to contend with. Starvo was able to send a huge dominate attack, and followed up with the Winter's Wail, threatening a Frostbite token to make sure that you couldn't do anything on your turn. Lexi, as we saw after Outsiders made her consistent deck, was able to send decently long combat chains with on hits that could shut you down, and she could use cards like 3 of a Kind and Codex of Frailty to still have a turn after blocking out. As for Prism with Luminaris, she was able to play auras with Spectra, which when attacked stopped the opponent's Go Again effects. And if you let her build that board state up, she could just pitch a yellow and throw Huge Angels, all her auras, auras and the kitchen sink back at you. Simply put, gaining easy action points through hero abilities, weapons, and even equipment proved to be too strong. And as James White explains,
as the card pool grows, more powerful cards become available. There kind of needs to be like a counterbalance to that in some ways.
In fact, looking at all the heroes in Classic constructed to so far hit Living Legend, all but one of them are guilty of abusing action points. And the one hero that didn't do this was Oldhim, who broke the game in another way, being the most consistent fatigue deck. He did so by using cards like Rampart of the Ram's Head and Crown of Seeds, cycling through his deck and setting up the end game far better than any other hero while mitigating damage. And if that wasn't enough, you could also just drop a channel like Frigid or smack them with a Winter's Wail to give them a Frostbite. Now, for those of you who may be newer to Flesh and Blood, I'll quickly explain what happened with Tales of Aria. It's been said over and over by James in various interviews, but the set was designed at the peak of the 2020 pandemic, when New Zealand was under incredibly strict lockdowns. The team simply wasn't able to properly test this set's balance, and so this is how we got cards like Crown of Seeds, Unerratted Briar, Duskblade, Rosetta Thorn, Voltaire, Ball Lightning, Winter's Wail, Awakening, to name a few. It's pretty safe to say that as powerful as Monarch was, Tales of Aria was the set that truly broke Flesh and Blood. Even Starvo, who was released in the next set Everfest and proceeded to speedrun Living Legend, was as powerful as he was because of Tales of Aria. He was all three elements and a guardian. Take all the worst parts of Oldhim, throw in some lightning and some crippling crushes, and you've got what many consider to be the most unfun hero ever printed in the game. This sudden surge in power left a pretty bitter taste in a lot of players' mouths as Flesh and Blood began to feel like a far more explosive game than it had been initially. Less and less it was a game of back and forth interaction, each player trying to outmaneuver the other in close matches. Instead, it increasingly felt like it was just a race to 40, and getting completely obliterated in games was becoming far too common. People were rightfully upset with this because for many, the whole appeal of Flesh and Blood was in those close games and tight interactions. Personally, if I wanted to play a game where I just had to watch someone else do cool things for 20 minutes and then I just died, I'd go back to playing Yu-Gi-Oh! And even with the 7th set, Uprising, we saw some similar issues continue. Fi was almost completely busted at the start, causing an immediate blitz ban of Stubby Hammerers, with a Classic constructed ban following soon after. The deck only truly fell off in CC after the banning of the Belittle Minnowism combo, which was a resource positive combo and was busted in its own right. Dromai, while being known as the best deck that can't convert for a long time, still had incredibly polarizing matchups with their Dragon board states and would eventually become one of the top meta contenders, being the deck that countered the post-Outsiders Lexi. And Iyslander, who was originally released in Everfest but didn't see proper support until Uprising, was such an oppressively good hero that Michael Hamilton used her to take down the first ever World Championships. The game had grown so much in power, it no longer felt like the Flesh and Blood people had fallen in love with in the first 3 sets. And when heroes were releasing only to dominate the meta until they hit Living Legend or received bans, it put the game in a more and more unhealthy spot. So what was LSS to do? I have identified 3 core design changes that have been implemented in Flesh and Blood since Dynasty's release, affecting the overall power of the game. The first and most important was reducing the ease of gaining action points on heroes, weapons, and equipment, aka those Sip cards, which I struggle to say with a straight face. Sip. It's almost as goofy as wearing a frog hat. The second change is simply a far more liberal use of lower hero life totals, which in hindsight is notoriously absent from any of the most powerful heroes the game has ever seen. And the third and final change is simply a healthy increase in the game's variance. To start, looking at the action point economy of newer cards, you'll notice that from the past 4 sets, only 2 of the new heroes are able to generate more, those being Dash.io and Max with the crank mechanic from Bright Lights. Historically, heroes that can generate more action points than others are often better than those who don't, but that doesn't mean these new heroes are that bad, and it certainly doesn't mean that they're boring. For example, Azuri lets you switch out your small 0-cost stealth attacks for bigger 2-cost attacks with devastating on-hits. Think cards like Command and Conquer and Shakedown. New Prism can freely play Figments from her deck if she puts Heralds into Soul, and can then transform those Figments into Angels for both awesome attack triggers and much needed protection. However, while these abilities are super cool and interesting, they're just not quite as strong as give go again for free and gain an extra hand of cards each turn. Even the weapon designs have changed drastically. Looking at a card like Sandscour Greatbow versus Voltaire, you can see the distinct lack of activate twice and give an arrow go again on the Greatbow. Instead, it utilizes aim counters, which are by comparison weaker as it's a much slower playstyle, but it's also a lot more interesting and fair. An even better comparison to make is the more direct one of the OG Luminaris versus Numinaris. Luminaris is, in my humble opinion, the most busted weapon the game has ever seen. Numinaris, on the other hand, Go Again now costs 2 resources, which is quite a bit in an already resource-intensive deck. On top of that, it only gives Go Again to Heralds and Angels specifically, so no using cards like Miraging Metamorph unless it's to end your chain. And it's also only once per turn, so you can't even use a Herald of Erudition into an Archangel of Erudition for a big turn without also having a card like Angelic Descent to make it happen. You can still have powerful turns with Prism, sure, but my lord, do you have to jump through a lot of hoops to make it happen. Just, James, please, for just a little bit, can we have Luminaris back? I mean, how am I supposed to win without being carried by a broken weapon?
Okay, here you go. Next time, make your video before we release cards that mess up your point, dummy.
And you can see this type of design throughout all of the newer sets. Bolton finally got cards that either give themselves Go Again or can pump themselves for his ability to do so, but they require yellow cards specifically to be charged into Soul. Vincent has the Grimoire that can give her an Eloquence token, which gives a non-attack action Go Again, but it's just a pay and do it. She could only do it once, and it will also apply Blood Debt for the rest of the game. Certainly a downgrade from her predecessor. That's for sure. Even when it comes to equipment like the Black Tech Whisperers, these are often pushed into the sideboard when compared to Snapdragon Scalers, a common from the very first set of the game. That's not to say these legs are bad, far from it, but they are very conditional. You can only use them on assassin attack actions and only when they hit. They do block for 1 battle worn, which is awesome, and you can recur them by paying 2 silver. But how do you get those silver? Well, you hit with your contract cards and hope to hit the right cards off your opponent's deck. Arachne at least lets you have some control over this, but it's still not a sure thing. It's also very slow. And this jumping through hoops design of a lot of these new cards and strategies reminds me a lot of the early days of Fab. For example, let's look at the hero Dorinthia. Dorinthia's whole strategy revolves around hitting twice with the Dawnblade, getting counters, and overwhelming the opponent. To do so, she needs to have some form of Go Again, attack with the Dawnblade, hit with it, usually with an attack reaction, swing it a second time, and hit that attack as well, all to get just a single counter on her sword. Dorinthia is certainly a hero that can snowball out of control, especially with newer cards like Glistening Steelblade, but she also has to work for it. Similarly, Black Tech Whisperers gives Go Again on your assassin attacks and can block and be recurred, but you have to hit twice and land the on-hit of your contract cards to do so. When it comes to action points, the powering down of Flesh and Blood simply feels like a return to the pre-Monarch era. Designs from the first 3 sets required players to actually put time and resources into accomplishing powerful plays. The power is still there, it's just not as easy to access as it was with heroes like Starvo and Chain, whose very abilities put them over the top. But what if a hero like Prism 2.0 still has access to those more powerful abilities and cards like Spectra? Well, that's simple. Just slap them with the lower life total so that faster decks can be what balances them in the meta. Earlier uses of lower life total can be seen in the Wizards Kano and Icelander, both of whom use arcane damage, which is rather hard to block. And while not too many new heroes have a lower life total, it is clear that newer designs will use it more liberally where needed, like with Prism. This is by far the most straightforward and easiest way to add some balance to more powerful designs. If a hero is going to output a lot of hard to block damage or have things like auras and allies that essentially gain you more life, it just makes sense for that hero to have less starting life total. But sometimes that alone isn't enough to weaken a hero properly. Take the new Dash.io or Dio, who starts with 4 less life than the normal 40, but is able to wildly abuse action points. As shown in her first big event, the Calling Melbourne, Thomas Dowling took her to a 14-0 record, only losing in the finals to Ben Dodd on Azuri. Using her ability to see the top card of the deck and to play crank items at instant speed, as well as utilizing cards like High Octane and Tome of Fiendal, Dio can generate upwards of 5 or 6 extra action points in a turn. That's on top of Go Again. Not only can she do a full maximum velocity turn, but she can finish it off with 4+ attacks from her charged up Symbiosis shot. Sounds oppressive? Well, it certainly can be. That is, until the Dio player draws a hand of 3 items, can barely block, and dies. Or maybe you're using a Twin Drive to double boost past that Tome of Fiendal on top, only to hit the second one right after. Or maybe you manage to arsenal that Tome of Fiendal, but it just draws you a useless item and another high octane when you really just needed more attacks. And playing instant speed boom grenades is incredibly strong. It just sucks when they're in your hand instead of on top of the deck. This isn't even to mention that with all the boosting the Mechanologist class does, if you block enough during a game, they're just gonna run out of steam and you can fatigue them. So while Dash has an incredibly high ceiling, she's brought down by also having a fair amount of variance. Max as well has a bit of variance utilizing the boost mechanic, although his power lies in the Nitro Mechanoid that released in Dynasty. If you can set it up with a high octane, you can have super powerful turns with this construct, but that's provided you don't boost it away and you can set up 3 hyperdrivers and, actually get it off. Even once you do this, well, you better hope you kill the opponent because you lose all your equipment and even your weapon to this thing. Again, there's a lot of power here to be gained, but there is some variance and you have to set it up first. Speaking of setting things up, Tekla Boston is probably the best example of how much payoff a hero can get if they do so. It can take a while getting 4 Evos equipped, but once you do, you not only have Singularity, but also the Evo payoff cards that serve as 3 for 9s with on hits and evasion. His biggest problem is getting to that point, making him not that good and competitive, but if you can, he's a genuine force to be reckoned with. Unless you're playing against Kano, then he just kind of gets melted. Between making heroes work harder for action points, reducing life totals where necessary, and increasing variance in the game, it definitely feels like heroes and decks are much more balanced than they were in the previous era of Flesh and Blood. There's certainly power in the new card designs, but it's not so easily attained, unless you're willing to risk those low rolls with the highs. And it's also clear that the designers still want singularly powerful cards to exist. Codex of Frailty and Warmonger's Diplomacy are both very strong cards that stand on their own. And the 2 demi-heroes, Leviah and Blasmafet, and the Mecropotent are incredibly cool cards that pack tons of power and, in Leviah's case, mitigate downsides. They're just a bit tricky to use is all. I personally really like where the game is at now, as again, it feels like a return to the level of design we saw in the first few sets, just way more interesting. I got into the game before Monarch, and so I remember how balanced everything was back then, and I'm really glad to see Classic Constructed return to this point. Powerful plays need to be worked for, and if a hero is going to be a bit degenerate, they could be brought down with some lower starting life total and or a sprinkle of variance. But just because I'm a fan of these changes doesn't mean that everyone has been, and bringing the power level down while older heroes like Lexi were still in the meta had its downsides.
Hate. Double hate. Loathe entirely.
One of the biggest issues that came with this powering down of the game was that, aside from a little bit with Azuri, pretty much all of the new heroes had minimal, if any, competitive impact. Dusk Till Dawn was by far the worst offender, as the 2 new heroes and 2 buffed heroes came, went, and were quickly forgotten. Against a hero like Lexi, who after Outsiders was pretty over the top, how could these slower heroes stand up? This led to a few issues that affected Flesh and Blood for many months down the line, and that we're only now seeing remedied as Lexi has finally hit Living Legend. The first issue is that, quite simply, the metagame became very boring. When one deck is at the top and everyone is either playing it or playing the hero that counters it, it can push a lot of people away from competitive play. And this is probably what made Living Legend checks become once a week, not once per banless update. Not only were people burnt out from the same meta, but it also meant that most players weren't bothering to build the new decks that were coming out. After all, why would you build something if it's impossible to win with? Now, while we know that's not the case, as the Calling Melbourne showed us, Lexi placing 3rd and 2 newer heroes coming 1st and 2nd, it was still a fair sentiment. Why pay into a new deck if it wasn't going to be as good as what already exists? Yes, Flesh and Blood is a game that primarily rewards hero mastery, but why master a weaker hero when you can just master the clearly best one? This ultimately meant that far less people were clamoring for new cards, and it affected the price of new sets pretty drastically. This could be seen mostly in the value of legendaries, where some were reaching the low prices of $10 to $15. And while this might sound great for players at first, it's not so great when stores struggle to profit from selling sealed boxes or cards, some stopping and dropping the game altogether. As much as cheap cards are nice to buy, at the end of the day, stores need to be able to profit off of Flesh and Blood, and weak sets that no one wants can be disastrous. But thankfully, this era of the game is not to last forever. In fact, after Dash.io performed so well, people wanted to play the new best deck, even though it was Azuri who won, but whatever. Going 14-0 was insanely impressive. This resulted in the prices of many Bright Lights cards shooting up in value, proving that all it took was for heroes to be good and people would want the cards in droves. And now, with Lexi gone, Icelander on the way out, Dromai powerful but very targetable and heavy hitters on the horizons, it seems like we're beginning to usher in yet another new era of the game. Where Monarch through Uprising era was the breaking of Flesh and Blood, and the Dynasty to Bright Lights era the mending of Flesh and Blood, perhaps this new era we're entering in will be the golden era of Flesh and Blood. An era with tons of unique heroes, spectacular card design, balanced and fun metagames, a healthy market for new sets, and a wonderful continuation of building this amazing fantasy world to get even the most disappointed players excited again. At least, that's my hope. The game is starting to feel far more fresh and balanced than it has in a while, and I don't think I'm the only one noticing this. Sentiments for the game seem to be positive again, and as of finishing this script, we're just a couple days away from the second World Championships. I'll edit in whoever won here. And I have to say, it must have taken a lot of courage and a leap of faith for LSS to power down Flesh and Blood instead of power creeping it more, but I think it will be far better in the long run for it. While playing broken over-the-top decks is fun, I think it's better that it stays within a format like Blitz or Living Legend. Let Classic Constructed, the main competitive format, be as healthy and balanced as it can be so as to let players' skills shine above anything else. Whatever they decide to do, the team behind this game have shown that they have a vision and aren't afraid to chase it, and no matter what happens, I'm happy to sit back and enjoy the ride. Although I do kind of feel like I forgot to mention something in this video. I just can't remember. Riptide! I forgot to mention Riptide! Just like LSS did when they banned Bullseye Bracers. But you know who I'm not forgetting? My patrons. If you want to support me in videos like this, you can find the link in the description below. Huge thanks to the GigaChad Saint, Geeks First, Elixir, Smokeopotamus, John, Ty, James, Chemical, Bryant, Transient Fire, and the newest one, Dark Memoria. Then we've got the Alpha Chad Thomas and the Super Chads Bruno, Jake, Thal, Cece, Eric, Ben, Zajima, Cameron, and Yogbadoodles21. Thanks again as always, and stay Chadly, my friends.